It's going to be a tough act to follow. Thank you, Dr. Morrison, and thank you, Regent University. It's an honor and privilege to be here this morning. I'm delighted to be on this panel with KT and Aram. Speaking of this time of day reminds me of what Ronald Reagan once said about the collision of time and day and age. And when you speak, and he quipped that the definition of middle age is when you're faced with two temptations and you choose the one that gets you home in bed by 9:30. A side note, I'm delighted to tell you I just this week turned in the manuscript for Last Act, which is the third book I've written on Ronald Reagan. It's about his post-presidency, and contrary to popular belief, he didn't go back to California and announced he had Alzheimer's and then passed away. There was a lot of living that went on in those 15-plus years, as you'll discover when the book comes out. But it only took 3 years to complete. So, I was asked not too long ago about the whole practice of writing, and was it profitable, and what form of writing is more profitable? Is it books, or is it op-eds, or is it penning speeches? And I thought for a moment, and I said the most profitable form of writing is ransom notes. I'm also begun work on a book about Reagan in the wilderness, and it goes to the point of this conference here today. From 1976 to 1979, he went through a complete ideological makeover, and because Reagan in this time ends up rejecting the containment and détente policies which had dominated American policy toward the Soviet Union to the time of George Kennan and the famous long telegram in which he advised Truman to contain the Soviets. This has been our policy through détente for 40-plus years, and he comes to believe in this time in the late 70s that the Soviet Union can actually be defeated. It earned him the scorn of the neocon establishment who thought that the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall were things of permanence, that the Cold War was a thing of permanence. Their patron saint at the time was Henry Kissinger, who equated the West with Athens and the East with Sparta, who codified the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the Accords, which he urged President Ford to sign, which he did sign, over the objections of Dick Cheney, who was his chief of staff at the time. And he said in late 1979 he could support every Republican running for president in 1980 except Ronald Reagan. He also once said, "How did it ever occur to anyone that he should be governor, much less president?" 12 years later, after his election in 1992, he was given what turned out to be his farewell remarks to the Republican Party at their convention in Houston. He'd made other speeches in 1993 and 1994, but this was his last speech to a national convention starting in 1960 when he was simply a private citizen and head of Democrats for Nixon. At this time, of course, in 1992, the Soviet Union had already surrendered, collapsed, and to his great misfortune, George Bush did not make this event the event of our lifetime, and the greatest struggle of our lifetime, in which billions were spent, national defenses raised, a president assassinated over, 38,000 American boys dying in one Cold War eruption, 58,000 young men dying in another, went nearly unremarked and unnoticed. This was, in my opinion, a great tragedy because the American people needed to be told that they won, that Soviet communism lost, and the sacrifices in South Korea and South Vietnam and other locations were not in vain, and that moral right triumphed over immoral evil. That's why Reagan called it an evil empire, and he never backed away from it till the day he died. Reagan issued a statement and went on Nightline the night of the Berlin Wall fell, which was the prelude, of course, to the coming collapse of the Soviet Union. But he was understandably restrained, yet it seemed to some he was itching to give what may have been the greatest speech of his lifetime. And I think that most of us would agree that it was a speech that Franklin Roosevelt or John Kennedy, Reagan could have given in their sleep. In some ways later, Reagan addressed the matter, but without embarrassing Bush. And he did so at the Houston Convention, which is both widely regarded as one of his greatest and yet overlooked. He was trying to stitch back together a divided Republican Party in 1992. I'm not going to do his, I'm not going to try to inflect his voice, but I'll read you what he said at the Houston Convention. Quote, "But we stood tall and proclaimed that communism was destined for the ash heap of history. We never heard so much ridicule from our liberal friends. The only thing that got them more upset was two simple words: evil empire. But we knew then what the liberal Democrat leaders just couldn't figure out, that the sky would not fall if America restored her strength and resolve. The sky would not fall if an American president spoke the truth. The only thing that would fall would be the Berlin Wall." He continued, "I heard those speakers at that other convention saying, 'We won the Cold War,' and I couldn't help wondering, just who exactly do they mean by we?" Close quote. Reagan knew. He always knew. Going back to his days in Hollywood when Soviet agents and provocateurs and their friends and supporters, including a healthy number of Democrats such as Henry Wallace and Alger Hiss, that the Soviets always had a political beachhead established in the United States of America. When Soviet agents threatened to throw acid in his face in the 1940s, and when the Soviet-backed weathermen in the 1960s said they had a bullet at their headquarters with Ronald Reagan's name on it, he knew in the most personal terms, and he was so concerned that he actually hired private security to protect his wife and two children. A strike by a communist-leaning union in 1946 shut down the studio and was beginning to film night unto night. But Reagan pushed back and with help broke the strike. Later, Communist member Sterling Hayden told Congress, "We ran into a one-man battalion, Ronald Reagan." The striking union was later learned to be was funded by Moscow. During his time as governor, two men tried to light gasoline bombs and throw them in his home where he and Nancy and the son Ron were sleeping. Security agents fired at the two men, but they slipped away in the darkness. And yet, to his everlasting credit, when he testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, he didn't advocate evicting communists from the United States. He said that the United States was strong enough to tolerate all points of view as long as they were peaceful. That stood him out from Robert Taylor and other actors who were cooperating with HUAC, who called for the expulsion of communist provocateurs and the Hollywood trade unions. But there is an irrefutable fact. In 1980, we were losing the Cold War. By 1989, we were winning the Cold War. As Jeane Kirkpatrick said in her now famous speech to the Republican National Convention in August of 1984 about the San Francisco Democrats, quote, "From the fall of Saigon in 1975 till January 1981, Soviet influence expanded dramatically in Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, South Yemen, Libya, Syria, Aden, Congo, Madagascar, Seychelles, Nicaragua, and Grenada. Not all the Democrats," close quote, "not all the Democrats were pro-Soviet, anti-American. That's ridiculous, to be sure. There are many good anti-communist Democrats over the years, from Harry Truman to Hubert Humphrey to John Kennedy and later Scoop Jackson. But there were, for whatever reason, a number of Democrats in the 1980s who were, you call them fellow travelers, or you call them fifth columnists, or you call them deconstructionists, or you call them provocateurs, or simply soft on communism, or even, as Lenin's famous, useful idiots. They existed, and that is the essential point. These were the San Francisco Democrats to which Kirkpatrick was referring. From lobbyist Clark Clifford to writer Nicholas von Hoffman to another writer Anthony Lewis to historian Robert Dallek, many other prominent liberals, all in their own way, either spoke up for Soviet communism or denounced Reagan's stated goal of consigning it to the ash heap of history. The Soviets at the time called their policy irreversibility. Soviet surveillance was everywhere, and their embassy in Washington was regarded as little more than a forward operating post for the KGB. Even President Carter, who I happen to believe is a very good man, but was simply in over his head, he never understood the presidency, pushed ahead with his beloved SALT II treaties with the Soviets even after they invaded Afghanistan. And yet he still went on national television with Barbara Walters and expressed astonishment that the Soviets would do such a thing as invade another country. And yet from the day Reagan was elected, the Soviets never gained one more inch, and indeed he rolled back Soviet hegemony, beginning in Grenada and extending to Afghanistan and eventually the world. Let's be clear here. The Soviets gained ground against every American president from Woodrow Wilson to Jimmy Carter. And no Soviet dictator ever willingly gave up power in those 70-plus years. Gorbachev and the Soviets did not end the Cold War with Reagan's help. They surrendered, period, and without debate. Reagan used to tell a joke about Gorbachev, but it illustrated a larger point. Two guys were standing in line, he'd tell this joke, at a vodka store in Moscow. They were queued up, and they were there for days on end. And one man storms to the other, "I'm sick of this. I'm sick of waiting around. I'm sick of all the shortages all the time. I'm going to go to the Kremlin and shoot Gorbachev." And he left. And a couple of days later, he comes back, and his friend says, "Did you shoot Gorbachev?" And his friend says, "No, that line was longer than this one." During the war, but I think it illustrates a point, is that what Reagan wanted to defeat, he didn't want to defeat the Soviet Union, he wanted to defeat the idea. He understood that the way to beat an idea is with a better idea. During the war, Hollywood produced two of the most ridiculous pro-Soviet movies, Mission to Moscow and Song of Russia. I urge you to view them if you haven't already and see if you can watch them without becoming unwell. Further, he wrote that it was communism was John Patrick Dickens wrote in Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. Ronald Reagan's political consciousness developed during the Cold War. He also wrote, communism was always on his mind. Whether he was performing for the camera, dining out with his wife, negotiating labor contracts, and writing letters to friends, or later preparing to enter American politics on the world stage, close quote. To say that Reagan was preoccupied with the Soviets during his term of office is an understatement. In their highly regarded book, Reagan's Secret War, Marty and Annalise Anderson noted in the index that not one time is the Middle East even mentioned. He simply had more important things on his mind. Over the past few days, the now infamous Dear Comandante letter to Daniel Ortega, the communist dictator of Nicaragua, has been in the news. The details have not been discussed. It was signed by 10 members of Congress, which is interesting because it says it seems like communists always travel in packs of 10. Led by Congressman Jim Wright, the letter was, in a word, shocking. It said, quote, Dear Comandante, we have been and remain opposed to U.S. support for the military action directed against the people or government of Nicaragua's junta. Close quote. At the time, Newt Gingrich called the document unbelievable. It was nothing more than a solicitous salutation which directly interfered with Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. Other signers included Ed Bowen, author of the infamous Bowen Amendment, and Tip O'Neill's longtime roommate, Mike Barnes of Maryland, David Obey of Wisconsin, Robert Torricelli of New Jersey, and others. Gingrich went on the McNeil-Lehrer report with Stephen Soares of New York and basically wiped the floor with him. The letter used phrases such as friendly and prospect and goodwill and reduced press censorship, and I always thought, there was not supposed to be press censorship. What was groundbreaking in many ways about this letter was it was a direct contravention of Reagan's foreign policy when it came to Nicaragua. Curiously, no one at the Washington Post or the New York Times objected. And it didn't stop there. In 1987, Daniel Ortega went to Washington, negotiated directly with Jim Wright and the papal nuncio, bypassing the administration to negotiate peace talks. And even Reagan in his diaries called Jim Wright a stormtrooper. In the early days of the Reagan administration, Ted Kennedy, who was nothing like his brother, made an offer to the Kremlin that in exchange for him stopping Reagan's defense buildup, they would help him defeat Reagan's re-election in 1984. Even though this violated all sorts of laws, via Senator John Tunney, he told Yuri Andropov he would help him brush up on his propaganda skills and introduce him to the American television networks. Quote, the only real potential threat to Reagan are problems of war and peace and Soviet-American relations. Close quote. The Dear Comandante letter was preceded several years earlier by Senator John Kerry going to Managua, Nicaragua, and there in Managua he accused Reagan of committing terrorism. George Shultz, who was normally a calm observer of world crises, was Reagan's Secretary of State at the time, and he attacked Kerry and Senator Tom Harkin as, quote, self-appointed emissaries to the communist regime. Harkin replied to Shultz, calling his objections international McCarthyism, which in and of itself is mildly humorous because Joe McCarthy was rooting out communism in the Truman administration, and Harkin seemed to be rooting for communism in Nicaragua. These Democrats did not just trample on the Logan Act, they tore it up. And last week, ironically, Secretary of State John Kerry said he was in utter disbelief over the letter the Republicans sent to the mullah dictators of Iran. Lest we forget, during the pro-nuclear freeze movements in Europe and America at the early days of the 1980s, it came to light they were covertly being funded by Moscow. Reagan faced communist opposition his entire life. At the 1977 Conservative Political Action Conference, he told the crowd, "When a conservative says that a totalitarian communist is an absolute enemy of human freedom, he is not theorizing. He is reporting on the ugly reality captured so unforgettably in the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn." Again, to quote my old friend G. Kirkpatrick, and so in 1980, the American people elected a very different president. The election of Ronald Reagan marked an end to the dismal period of retreat and decline with the election of Ronald Reagan. The American people declared to the world that we have the necessary energy and conviction to defend ourselves, and that we have a well as deep a commitment to peace. Thank you.